Hi there, and welcome to the Collingswood Book Festival Author Chat with Jamie Duclos-Yourdon. My name is Rich Renner. I'm one of the volunteer organizers of the Book Fest, now entering our 19th year. We're planning an in-person book fest on Saturday, October 2nd, so stay tuned to our website, collingswoodbookfestival.com, and our Facebook page for details. Before we begin, the usual Zoom housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. If you have a question, please use the raise hand button, and if all goes well, we'll unmute your mic. And with that, we are pleased to present an author who joined us live back in 2016. Jamie Duclos-Yourdon is a freelance editor and technical expert who received his MFA in creative writing from the University of Arizona. His debut novel, Froelich's Ladder, was my favorite book of 2016. His new book, The Space Between Two Deaths, set in ancient Sumeria, is a fresh take on the ageless problem of finding your voice when the world is trying to take it away. Jamie Duclos-Yourdon joins us today from his home in Portland, Oregon. Jamie, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It looks like I'm in a bus station in New Mexico, but that's just my aesthetic, I think, is New Mexican bus station. So thank you for having me.
It's all very pleasing. In the Zoom age, I've never seen better. So I mentioned that your first book was my favorite book of the year. I found it funny, extraordinarily imaginative, magical, a modern day parable, and for me, a history lesson about the Pacific Northwest in the 1850s, which I knew really nothing about. But apart from the setting and era, should we expect the same territory of imagination in your new book?
Well, Froelich's Ladder, which was the first book I had published, but not the first book I had written, really was an education for me in how to marry creative storytelling to an approachable narrative, which is to say, I finally developed the secret sauce of placing a narrative in a very specific time and place so the reader can kind of hang their hat on, this is taking place in 1850s Oregon, or this is taking place in ancient Iran. Because if you want to take a walk away from reality and to introduce concepts that are fantastical, they need that basis. And it took me a long time to discover that. So this is a roundabout way of saying, yes, this next book, we have a talking crow, which I kind of feel at least every second or third book should feature. We have trips to the underworld from a very early point, and we spend at least a quarter of the book in my conception of, I'm saying the underworld, I'm pretty sure the book says the netherworld. So yeah, so it does, I do stray from reality again. These are good days to stray from reality, I think. But there is a basis in reality. There is a basis in historical precedent. So it's not just like, boo, like off into my brain.
Well, so you mentioned the other books that you have written. Are they all that fabulist kind of style? Or is that?
I flirt with realism every so often. I tend to write about a book a year. And at this point, I will hand off a manuscript to my agent, who I've been working with since 2016. It was a good friend of mine as well. And I'll say, what do we have here? Because you need to bridge the gap between art and commerce. And sometimes you don't want to bridge that gap. Sometimes you say, this is some lovely art you've made, and it's just not commercial. It's just, we can establish a bridge and we can get to a commercial place if that's a trip you feel like taking. But I wrote a book somewhere in, I think in 2018, I wrote a book about a fictional backgammon tournament set in Terre Haute, Indiana in 1977. That was the premise. And for that, so that's about as close to reality as I come. That was somewhat contemporary, and Indiana, there's nothing fantastical about Indiana whatsoever. I'm going to get some mad emails about that comment. But typically, I'm a real-time reader of what it is that I'm putting on the page. I need to exist in this space. and I need a degree of fabulism, of fantasy. I need somewhere for my imagination to travel. So my stories tend to be, I'd say 80%, 90%. I'll say fantastic. I don't mean it in the sense that they're all the best book you're ever going to read, but in terms of fantasy.
No, I knew what you meant, but I will say that your books are fantastic and fantastic. When did you start writing?
I remember taking it very seriously around 8th grade. I grew up in a reading household, the family of readers, and the leap from reading to writing, I always took it as kind of self-evident. Why would one not? Why would not one go from being a reader to a writer? And it's only in recent years that I realized that that's not always the case. But when I was in 8th grade, I haven't thought about this in a very long time. There was a senior, so my school went from kindergarten through 12th grade. And when I was in 8th grade, there was a senior who used to come back to visit my homeroom teacher because he'd had the same homeroom teacher. And he was the editor of the Creative Writing magazine. And his name, if anyone on the internet knows his name, that would be fantastic. His name was Miles P. Finney. I remember that name for 30-something years, 31 years. And he was really cool. And I was 13 and he was 18, and 18 is essentially an adult when you're 13. And he was really cool. And I thought being a writer could be really cool. And because I wrote so much, I had that smidge of ego that said to me, like, I could probably do that. So it was in 8th grade that I started to write short stories that I took fairly seriously. And the moment I was in high school, I sought out the Creative Writing magazine that he had been the editor of, and just kind of kept progressing. At a certain point, I realized that for a not very motivated student, I could major in English and I could minor in creative writing, and I could spend all my time doing this stuff, which was so much more entertaining than math. So I just, as long as I had to lease out my body to the school, I might as well let my brain go where it wanted to go.
I'm going to remember that name, Finney, because I think it was 8th or 9th grade when I read a separate piece. And the character Finney had such a profound effect on me. I still remember the exact moment when he died. So now that name stuck with me forever. Did you have encouragement from your teachers at that age?
I did. I received a lot of encouragement with my writing. I think also, I was one of the students who always, the comments my teachers always made spoke to my potential. Jamie has great potential, but he just doesn't seem to really marshal it. And I think when it came to writing, they saw that that was something that hooked me. So let's promote that. And because my children are now 10 and 8 and talk about how little they like school, I talk to them about the fact that the older you get, the more school can really become a laser focus on what it is that you want to study. What is your pursuit, And again, I was just shedding the sciences, shedding math, just getting it off of me so I could get to a point where I was just telling stories. And I pursued that all the way through a master's degree, at which point I kind of thought to myself that because I did not envision a future of teaching, a doctorate would just be redundant, strictly from an educational point of view for myself. A master's was a terminal degree for me. But yeah, everywhere along the line, I had at least one teacher who would kind of give me a pat on the head or a pat on the back and just kind of encourage me along. Those are your first readers. It's your audience at first.
And because it all started at that age, is that how you found yourself in that fantastical realm?
No, actually, because when you're taught writing in an academic perspective, you're taught to write serious things, and you don't really have any. I was about to say you don't have any serious life experience at a certain age. Certainly, you may, but you haven't been kind of dinged and dented by 30, 40, 50 years of life. So I have a short story somewhere that I wrote about Las Vegas, and I wrote it when I was 17, and I'd never been to Las Vegas. So it was on the basis of a movie or a TV show or something I'd seen, but I wanted to write about serious consequential things. And I remember it wasn't until I was in grad school that I wrote, I think they were nonfiction pieces at first, but things that introduced humor. And I realized I was able, I knew I could make people laugh in person, but I realized I can make someone laugh on the page. And I thought, that must be not easy to do because I don't see it all that often. But even then, it felt like apostasy to introduce humor into fiction. But I wrote 5 or 6 books before I introduced any kind of fantastical element. And really, it was just like I had been writing the New Yorker fiction that I had been brought up on, and it was not getting published. And I thought to myself, at the very least, I might as well write something that I want to read or that I enjoy writing. And I just kind of kept strolling down. And even after Froelich's Ladder came out, I turned right around and wrote an incredibly realistic book about a school shooting in Vancouver, Washington. And I sent it out, having published a book, and nobody wanted it. And I thought, you know, something like, I can write about heavy, weighty, pertinent subjects in a fantastical setting. I could still kind of do my job to the extent that there's a social contract involved. And I feel I did in the space of Between Two Deaths, and we'll talk about that. But I can do it while writing a fantasy novel. I could do it while introducing elements that are well outside the margins of realism.
Okay, so you mentioned it now. How do we end up in ancient Sumeria?
How do we end up in ancient Sumeria? When I started writing this book, the very first notion that I had, it was a short story. And I started to write a short story about a man who travels to the netherworld. I envision him traveling through a crack in the earth to retrieve his dead father. And he tries to retrieve his dead father, and he's unable to do so. And then when this protagonist returns to the surface, everyone says to him, "Oh, you're dead." And he says, "I'm not dead. I'm clearly not dead." They say, "Look at you. You are very evidently dead." That was the notion that I started with. And, you know, I futzed around with names and setting and what seemed appropriate. And as time went on, I realized that this was not the protagonist of the story at all. That there was, for this character to have made this journey to the netherworld, he left a family behind. And there were ramifications for having left. And the family he left behind had their own stories to tell. And so it expanded outward from the story to a novel. But it just didn't feel contemporary. It just didn't feel like a story that would be told even within the last 200, 300, 400 years. And as I was, I mean, who knows what I read or saw or what little kind of burr stuck on me, but I got the idea of Sumer, of ancient Sumer, which we all study, you know, in grade school to some extent in my mind. And I did a little bit of research, and the internet being what it is, I was able to get my hands on essentially a vocabulary list of ancient Akkadian, which is the language that was spoken there. And looking at these nouns, all of a sudden I had these character names. You know, it felt really weird to have a character who goes into the netherworld whose name is Bob. It could be, but it didn't feel like a Bob was going to take this trip into the netherworld. But when I was looking at these names and I saw Temen, which means, hold on, I brought my little like crib sheet here. Temen means foundation. And that was the name of this person who traveled to the netherworld in my story. And he is the foundation of his family. And when he is gone, the foundation doesn't hold anymore. And he left behind a wife named Mashara. Now, Mashara is a noun, and it means all the oaths or all the duties. And she is this woman who is left with these responsibilities now that he is gone. And he leaves behind a daughter as well, whose name is Ziz. And Ziz in ancient Akkadian means moth. And I just envisioned this little delicate, fluttering child who is kind of left exposed in this way. And all the characters' names grew out of these nouns. And so Sumer just wed itself to the story that I want to tell. And the more invested I became in telling a story set in ancient Iran, the more I realized I had to do a degree of research and speak to realities in terms of social realities. What would a marriage look like? What would a farming community look like? What would religious obligation look like? And then, I'm writing a novel. I give myself the liberty of making some things up. How could I color this environment with that seemed plausible and realistic and didn't stand out as the invention of the author, but at the same time broadened our perspective of this world that we're in.
And Jamie, is this a good segue into a reading? So we
Sure,
hear a little
absolutely.
bit of the book.
So I'm going to read the prologue, which is 4 pages long. I feel it's the right place to start, if only because when you open the book, it's the place where you start, but also because it references the event that essentially sets the entire story in motion. And also it introduces what is, to me, the central theme of the book, which I would like to talk more about and we'll return to. But it's about power dynamics, specifically who has the power and what fear does someone carry when they have power, the fear of losing it? What will they do in order to retain their power? And who doesn't have power in a certain dynamic? And how does that person survive in a dynamic in which they are powerless? So in a mere 4 pages, I think that we kind of delve into that. But yes, I'll read this and then we can take it from there.
Sounds good.
All right. The army of Nippur attacked before dawn. Scouts entered the city of Uruk through a half-dozen gates, followed soon thereafter by infantry soldiers who surged down the uneven streets. For many of the young men, it was their first military campaign, a fact reflected by their behavior. They sang songs, excoriated one another, and made horseplay. Soldiers entered houses at random, one-story mud brick structures grouped around open courtyards, where dazed Urukians soon found themselves cornered, befuddled by sleep and armed only with cooking implements. They wept and panted. They reeked of terror. Men above the age of 9 were slaughtered. Survivors would fetch a good price as slaves. Even the wives and daughters were defiled this day. Meanwhile, the Nippurians stole gifts for their loved ones and made jokes to soothe their nerves. By first light, the sky over Uruk was hazy with smoke. What little resistance the soldiers had encountered, they had gleefully quashed. As they made their way toward the central ziggurat, with its unique vantage point and terraced steps, they expected to find the worshippers of Enlil waiting for them. It was common during the summer months for one Sumerian city-state to invade another, and in doing so, to raise their temples and kill their Zagmi. On this day, however, the Nippurian soldiers would encounter something different. Inside the ziggurat, their footsteps echoed. Immense statues of Enlil gazed down at them, with devotional jars of honey placed at his sandaled feet. Below the main shrine were rooms meant for food storage, as well as a mausoleum for the city's Mitu. And it was here that the soldiers found the Zagmi and their stewards. Not a single one was still alive. They'd all ingested poison, a variety of berry that stained the tongue when chewed, but also proved to be fatal at a sufficient volume. It appeared that the worshippers of Enlil, privy to their fate, had embraced death on their own terms. In room after room, the soldiers encountered their corpses, bellies distended and tongues blackened, bowels emptied upon the floor, each face a hideous mask. For every Zagmi, they counted 4 stewards, boys with shaved heads and eyebrows, some only recently parted from their mothers, often clinging to each other in death. Perhaps the soldiers thought of their own siblings back home, or the succor of childhood they had so recently enjoyed. Each level yielded more rooms and more bodies, their skin still warm, the silence deepening. The soldiers were distraught. They tore at their hair and swallowed their tears. This was not the natural order of things. It was their prerogative to kill the Zagmi, not the Zagmi's prerogative to kill themselves. As word of the mass suicide spread among the ranks, a greater concern surfaced, one that could be seen on every face. If the Zagmi could orchestrate their own death, what further authority was forfeit? What power had the Nippurians ultimately ceded? On this day, The army of Nippur killed everything. Every woman or child who had been spared for auction, every household pet or stray animal. The soldiers became the gears of a terrible machine. They were rage and savagery. Even some of the soldiers who had been present at the temple were murdered by their peers simply for bearing witness. Gone was their laughter from before. There was no joy taken in this reprisal. Once every dwelling had been searched and the final death toll had been tallied, the city of Uruk was incinerated to affirm the dominance of Nippur. There would be another consequence. For the first time in recorded history, more Mitu now populated the netherworld than living souls populated the natural world. The wholesale death of so many men, women, and children had tipped the scales. As a result of this imbalance, a rift occurred. The netherworld swelled to accommodate its growing ranks and to represent its newfound prominence, thus testing the boundaries of the natural world. The earth split in two. This phenomena could be observed for miles around, far beyond the ashes of Uruk, where people of many nations would comment on the disturbance, speculate, and then resume their normal lives. That is the prologue. And after that, more people died, more terribly.
Well, thank you for reading that. So from the prologue, some important details are provided to us. Among them, we are introduced to the word Mitu. I'm going to ask, knowing, are they the dead?
They are the dead. So it's spelled M-I-T-U, and that is another Akkadian word. So maybe Mitu. Mitu was stuck in my head, and kind of, I don't want to say consequently, but I wrote this in 2016. The title of the book was Me Too. And in 2018, when the Me Too movement took on real precedence, my agent and I had to have a very serious conversation about, is this too on the nose? Because this is a very feminist book, and this is very much about, like I said, about power dynamics and about representing those without power. But it felt just not appropriate. Just like I was trying to ride a wave, and then I would spend way too much time explaining away the fact of like, no, it's an ancient word. But yes, Me Too or Mitu does mean dead person in this book.
Okay, so also in the prologue, we learn that the overpopulation of the netherworld is the result of this horrific act, so many people dying all at once, that has filled up the netherworld, which causes an enormous rift in the earth, which you referenced that you wrote earlier. And along this rift is where we meet our first main character, Ziz, a young girl living on a farm with her parents. In the first chapter, we see the world through her eyes. What was your motivation for creating this character?
So, I'll take a step back and use that question as an opportunity to explain where I was writing this book from. So as I mentioned, I wrote the first draft of this book in 2016. 2016 was a really bad year. That feels quaint to say after we've all come through 2020. But back then we were all like, man, 2016 sucks. It was a year that a ton of celebrities died, and then Donald Trump got elected, which apparently a percent of the country was totally happy with. For me in 2016, in January of that year, my dad died very suddenly. And it completely upended my life. It touched everything. And it was my first real experience with grieving. And gosh, I must have known people who were grieving before. I must have read something about it, but I had no visceral experience. And I learned that grieving pulls you out of the living world. It is the most shocking and disjointed experience. It feels like there's a current that's running along and you have been lifted out of that current. And people look at you and they're kind of weirded out by it. They're like, I don't want to touch that. And they continue along in their current. So that was the manner in which I write every day. I write for an hour every day. It's not a very long time. I'm not able to accomplish a whole lot. I aim for about 350 words a day, but I do it every single day. And I do it first thing in the morning before anyone is awake in my house and anyone has any kind of demands or requirements of me. And it is certainly therapeutic. And when I was going through this really rough time, I knew that I was going to write my way into some kind of self-care. And this is something I've been doing, I've talked about since 8th grade. I've been doing for 30 years. But those early pages that I wrote, there was no emotional continuity. One day I would write a sentence, and another day I would write a page or two. But at the end of each day, I'd kind of crumple it up, not figuratively crumple up paper and toss it. But after a little while, there started to be some continuity. And after a while, I was writing this particular story. And the character who I envisioned following his father to the netherworld and coming back as a dead person, this was my metaphor for grieving. But as my 2016 went on, and as my grieving had to kind of play second fiddle to the life that I had to continue to live one way or another, I had worked with my father for many years, so I essentially had to find a new career. And my marriage suffered and ultimately ended as a result of this. And I went on book tour and met you at a point where, man, I just wanted to pull a blanket over my head and hide from the world and recover. But instead, I was on the road talking to audiences and thinking, I think I'm dead. So I couldn't, as a fairly responsible human being, I couldn't help but look around and see how my agony and my experience was also having kind of a devastating effect on people closest to me, on my ex-wife and on my children. And I looked at the story and I thought, this story, if I'm telling a whole story, if I'm telling a human compassionate story, we need to know about this man's family. What happens to them? What happens to their world when he leaves it? And like I said, ultimately, I did not care for Temin as my protagonist. Ultimately, I was like, man, I do not like you. I do not like the decisions you make. They're in keeping with your character, and we're not going to change it. But you're not a hero in any sense of the word. And his daughter, Ziz, I'm smiling because I'm thinking of a beta reader who said something about how the men in this book were not represented sympathetically. And I was like, dude, no one's represented sympathetically in this book. This casts a poor light on humanity in general. But if anyone is represented well, other than a crow, it is this girl, Ziz, who is just kind of trying her best to survive in the absence of an authority who is taking care of her and protecting her. I think I answered 9 questions right there. I feel like if people put their hands up, they're like slowly putting them back down again.
Well, I have more, so it's okay.
Oh, good. All right.
But first, before I ask any more, I do want to apologize for adding to the gloom of that year, because that year our book festival was rained on and we had to move the whole
lovely gymnasium. I recall it fondly. I had a nice time there.
Your mood would have been lifted a little probably if we were outside on a sunny day like we usually are, but so
New Jersey always lifts my mood, even thinking of it, even saying the words.
Oh,
smile on my face.
Well, we hope to have you back here again soon. As I mentioned in the beginning, we will be live again this October. But back to our characters. Before we talk about all the others, and you already mentioned all the ones that I wanted to talk about, including the crow, were you tempted as part of the grieving process to stay in this world of the fantastical setting as opposed to, is this your way of dealing with grief instead of realistically writing memoir style? Was it too much to approach it that way? Or was this something because you'd already had this idea prior, or did you?
Oh, no. I'd been at work on a completely different book that just felt wildly inappropriate the moment my father died. I was, it's funny. I'll say a word that locally in Portland has great significance. I think elsewhere in the country means nothing to people. Vanport. Do you know anything about the city of Vanport?
No.
I will give a very brief. First of all, Vanport is worth like going off and Googling in your spare time. Portland, Oregon is at the northernmost point of the state, and then there's a river, and then there's Washington State, and the southernmost city in Washington is Vancouver, Washington, which is obviously different from Vancouver, Canada. And during World War II, in the little space between those two cities, an incorporated city was founded by Henry Kaiser and named Vanport for Vancouver and Portland. It was a portmanteau. And it built the majority of boats that we used in World War II. It was the second largest city in Oregon, and it existed for about 6 years or so, and it existed solely to make these boats. And it was in Oregon, a state that has a very racist history. It was an integrated city. It was a remarkable, unusual, defined by history setting. And then it was kind of, as soon as the war was done, it was depopulated. And then there was an accident that was very similar to what took place in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina. Levees broke and waters flooded Vanport, and it was essentially washed away in a day. But I was at work on this city and telling a story, historical fiction based there. And then all of a sudden, the specifics of my life changed with the death of my father. And just this story, it just wasn't a vehicle anymore for anything I felt I wanted to tell or was capable of telling. And just, I don't know, then a new story came along. And that new story is the space between two deaths.
Well, thank you. That ties up all the loose ends about the origin of the story that I had questions about, except for one. One of the characters is a crow, as you mentioned, that is able to communicate with humans in an interesting way, in a way that to me made a lot of sense. I think of crows already as, being pretty smart. If they had the anatomy for human speech, I'm sure we would have great conversations with them. But the limitations for speech you portray by giving this crow the ability to speak one-syllable words when it's very clear that this bird has a lot to say. So how did all that manifest?
I wish I remembered specifically when or how I decided that I wanted to write this crow. Certainly this is not the first, second, or 100th reference of a crow in fiction. I'm not, writers love to write crows into their stories almost as much as they love to make their main characters novelists. But so I will say to people who haven't read the book, the significance in the narrative of this crow is that crows they're portrayed as the only living things that can travel back and forth to and from the netherworld. They can go and then they can come back. And so the main character, Temin, essentially kidnaps a crow and uses the crow to go to the netherworld to bring him, and then ultimately to bring him back from the netherworld. But he manipulates the crow into doing this. And the way he manipulates the crow is by stealing the crow's tail feather. By taking away the tail feather, he essentially has removed the essence of birdness from this crow. And the crow is desperate to get it back. And in the crow's desperation, is willing to do anything. You want to go to the netherworld? We'll do that. Just please return this essential part of me to me. And I think initially when I was writing this, it was just the crow came from just the desire to write a crow. It was fun. I liked the voice. He's written in all caps. And like you said, he speaks monosyllabically. And so that presented a little bit of a challenge. He's a bit of a dick, and I kind of like that as well. I keep saying he. The crow doesn't have any gender definition in the book. I'm correcting myself, not that I imagine anyone else is going to show up to correct me. But as I wrote my way into this book, I have an experience, I can't say with every book I've written, but almost every book where, like I said, I write for an hour every day. And I write about a page and a quarter every day. And I end up thinking of the books that I'm writing, it takes me about 9 months to a year, as a space that I'm living in. I'm living in this story for a year. I live there long before any readers get into it. And it's like building a house from the ground up, and as you're building, certain limitations become obvious to you, certain requirements start to present themselves. Like at a certain point, we're gonna have to build out in this direction. And I find that I'm always about 2/3 of the way through a first draft when the book says to me in so many words, hey, listen, really glad you've been living in this space rent-free for however long, but you have obligations as a writer to me, the book, and now you need to start meeting these obligations because we've made it thus far and I need to have some kind of cohesion by the end of this process. And usually it's around that time that I figure out what it is I've been writing, what it is I've been telling up to this point. With the space between two deaths, and it's like the fourth time I've said the title out loud. I'd like to talk about what the title means at a certain point, but we'll come back to that. I was writing a scene, and in the scene, a little boy and a little girl are in a room together, and the little girl Ziz, who we've mentioned, and Ziz is very aware that she has no power in this room, that the boy has the power, and then the boy's mother enters the room. And Ziz is aware that at the point that the mother enters the room, the mother now has the power. But she thinks to herself, I wonder if the boy is aware of that. I wonder if someone who is accustomed to having power is aware when he essentially has lost it. And I was writing this scene and I thought to myself, oh, this whole book is about power dynamics. And I was able to look back at every single chapter I'd written before that and say to myself, who has the power in this chapter? What are they doing to retain it? Who doesn't have the power in this chapter? What are they doing to survive? And that was a question I could ask myself over and over again. And then I was able to take a step back from that and just say, look, I have these three narratives that are kind of braided together. One is a power structure that is very much related to social class. One is a power structure that's very much related to gender. And see, I'm coming all the way back around to the crow. One, this relationship between the crow and Temin is essentially a power dynamic around abuse, around physical abuse. Because Temin has taken this thing away from the crow. He's taken the tail feather. And the crow, as a victim, as a survivor, however you want to look at it, is trying to live with that abuse. And I was very deep into this book and very deep into writing the crow character before I realized that that was what the crow represented for me in this narrative. And that was a very, very important voice when talking about power dynamics. So, yet again, I think it probably brought it somewhere you may not have expected it to go. But there you have it.
No, I'm glad you did. And thank you for that too. And I know you wanted to talk about that central theme and also the title. Before we get too far into this hour here, we do want to let people ask some questions. So what was the significance of the title for you?
So, like I said, the book was Me Too for a very long time, and then all of a sudden we thought, we need to change the title. A therapist had pointed out to me at one point. A therapist had used the expression "the space between two deaths," and the way the therapist used this expression was, and he hadn't invented it. I honestly can't recall who he was lifting it from. I tried to find out. He essentially said, any one of us, a person will experience a death. And the death could be a literal death. We could use the example of my father dying, or the death could be a figurative death. It could be a breakup. It could be being fired from a job. It could be any kind of termination of something that was in play. And that you experience the first literal death, the actual death of the human being, the actual dissolution of the marriage. But then you kind of pass through time before you're actually able to accept and internalize that death. And that experience of internalizing it can look many different ways. You're driving a car and you hear a song and you're like, oh my God, we're never getting back together again. Or your father's birthday passes and it's a birthday you're not celebrating with him because he's gone. You think, oh my God, he's really, but you have this second experience where the death becomes real for you. And what the therapist said to me was, there's a space between these two deaths that we must travel. It could be days, it could be weeks, it could be years. But that space in between is this kind of limbic variable space. And I thought to myself, that in many ways, that's what this book was talking about. It was talking about traveling in a space between two deaths. And I tidily have a character use that metaphor in a way where I'm like, she says the space between two deaths. And so that's why it's on the cover of the book. Totally makes sense. But that's what I was writing. That's what I was referencing when I used it as a title.
Well, earlier you made mention of those who haven't read the book yet. So technically that's a lot of people at this point because it hasn't launched yet.
That's true.
So tell us when that's going to be, when the book.
The book is available for pre-order now. It can be pre-ordered through Amazon. Any local independent bookstore can also order it for you, though you may need to make that request if it's not immediately visible on their website. But the book officially is available on April 6th. And prior to that, yes, anyone who's read it prior to that is reading it in advanced copy form for the purposes of writing a review.
So 1 month from now, it's fitting that today we're recording this on March 6th.
Exactly.
Well, again, as I said, we're almost up on 1 hour here, so we do want to get to our questions. And I know we had one earlier from Jonathan. If you are still remembering what that question was, now's your chance.
Thank you. So actually, y'all did wonderful as far as my questions go. I just want to honestly thank all three of y'all. I was blessed with an advanced review copy. I immediately loved it. I'm a big military history fan. So I really appreciated Mr. Yourdon's attention to detail when it comes to Sumeria, the uniqueness of the setting. Most any historical fiction, you're going to find it in Greece or Rome or Egypt. But Sumeria, I mean, as you showed perfectly, has just as a vibrant mythological setting and real life setting. I guess my only question is, besides, it's like I said, just thank you. It was excellent. And the way you wove it, it's like a modern day parable. I think that the classicists would have been proud of it if it was told back then in ancient times, the way you wove it. But will you not so much return, say, to ancient Sumeria, but will you return to historical fiction with the fiction being a mythological slant at any point in the future?
Well, thank you for holding on to that question. Yeah, John, I appreciate it. Good job. And thank you for being so kind. I've really learned. So we being my agent and I are currently shopping a book that's set in 1914 England. So right at the cusp of World War I. That is a book that's out in the world. I'm writing one right now that's set in West Virginia in 1899. And I'm conceiving of one that I'm really kind of super psyched about, set in Spain in the 1400s. I can't tell you how, I had to write so many books before it's not even like I accepted the fact. I just became aware of the fact that placing a narrative in an actual place and in an actual time is so essential for a reader, rather than saying, I don't know, it was a long time ago. You can kind of get away with that with Star Wars, a long, long time ago, galaxy far, far away. Though I have to say, Jonathan, I have to confess to this. There was a review on Goodreads by a reader who is some degree of an historian who pointed out that apparently Nippur, right? So the first 4 words of the book is the army of Nippur. Apparently Nippur didn't have armies. Apparently Nippur was a pacifist culture that didn't believe in that and thrived without warfare. So I blew myself out of the water theoretically in the first 4 words of the book. And it sounded like this reader made it maybe 6 words. It was I'm done with you, which is fine. I think that's totally fine. But at the same time, I had a writing group who read early drafts of this and asked me, is this a monotheistic culture or a polytheistic culture? And I had no idea because I hadn't done the research. But that was really critical information and to learn, like, well, who were their gods and what was their appreciation? Was there a heaven? Was there a hell? Was there an underworld? And the first chapters I wrote set in the underworld were so bad. They were so, like, I envisioned the underworld as a hallway lit with torches. That was basically all I could come up with. And I thought it was totally fine until, and this is, I'm going to badmouth George Saunders, which is old on my part. I love George Saunders so much that I had a dog named Saunders. But when I read Lincoln and the Bardo, which was, I thought, an amazing book. Can't really call it a novel. It was a great book. Saunders' description of what might be heaven, I thought, this is one of the most imaginative American writers working today. And it was the laziest description of heaven. It's like, it was a feasting table and it looked delicious. But if you look more closely, it's actually disgusting and maggots. And I was like, come on, man. Like, I look to you for more than that. But then I looked at my own chapters. I was like, oh, those suck even worse than yours. I have to do a better job. So I sat down, I thought, like, well, what are the most kind of horrific but basic nightmare, not scenarios, but settings, tableaus? Where would, if I was just kind of dropped into the void, what would the void look like? And I came up with 4 scenarios, and I thought that would be pretty horrible. And I wrote my way into it, and my writing group, we'd sit down and it's like, are you okay? Like, I'm worried, I think. And I was like, yeah, I did a good job. But so it's, to come all the way back around to your question, you held it for so long, I'll hold it too. I do envision setting my narratives in historical settings. And like I said, I'm writing about 1899 West Virginia. I studied up on Appalachia to the extent that I want to call it Appalachia, and that's not how to pronounce it. And I studied up on conjure and what their kind of rural magic looks like, and the relationship that magic has to Christianity, actually. Because I don't, much as this critic on Goodreads wanted to say and did say that I was essentially like pimping Sumeria in order to write a book, I want to do right by my setting. I'm not a dilettante, and I'm not trying to get away with something or ride a wave. So I'll do the research to the extent that it brings me into a fully formed, fully realized story. At which point I feel it is my professional training, it is my professional responsibility to move forward with that, with my imagination, and give it what I've got to give.
Absolutely.
You did mention to me, it may have been when we weren't recording, the research that you put into Sumeria, but that you felt that you were taking liberties with some things. For example, you completely made up the grieving rituals.
Yep, I completely made up. I think I referred to certain colors you wear, burying mirrors, holding a pebble under your tongue. These were all, if they had grieving rituals in the research I did, I certainly would have incorporated it, but there were none. And I think that's simply because it wasn't recorded, it wasn't passed down, but grief requires ritual.
Indigo?
Grief requires ritual.
Was indigo the color?
Indigo was a color, and that does represent the color palette for clothing was very limited as a result of what was available to dye clothing. So you could have blues. Indigo would have been prevalent. I think I wanted it to be a different color, and then I realized that color I think I wanted it to be red. It was just like, no, how? There was no red. I was like, oh. I don't actually want someone on Goodreads to be telling me that I'm wrong and I'm a moron, and it doesn't feel good. So I'm trying to avoid it if I can.
So burying mirrors, it's similar to what Jews do. We cover mirrors.
I grew up in Manhattan. I'm well aware. Yeah. Yeah.
And you can take from different, whatever you want to feel, you pull from different religions if you want. We don't like one ritual. Hey, pull from this one and make your own. Create your own.
Exactly.
Well, when I write my review, I'm just going to say he nailed the colors.
And I accept everything he said about Sumer on Facebook. Like, I don't want to hear otherwise. This is it. I'm going to teach my children.
I couldn't wait for somebody to write about the army of, not Uruk. Nippur, thank you. We're coming up on an hour. Did anybody else have any questions?
I don't have a question because I haven't read the book, obviously, but I really appreciate you explaining the title, because especially this past year, there's been so much death.
Yeah.
And like for me personally, there's been an insane amount of death of close people and adjacent people and, you know, friends of friends of friends of friends. And just that kind of idea of a path that you go is really an interesting way of thinking about grieving. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I'm very sorry to hear about the losses you've experienced. I don't think, and I'm not alone in saying this, we don't really have a culture in America around dying and around grieving. My experience was that grieving was really unattractive to people. But I mean, more so than just kind of turning up your nose at it, but they seem to have a visceral, distance, a desire to distance themselves from it. You're given a grace period of perhaps a week or so, and then people are like, come on, let's get rolling with your life.
Back to work.
But it's traumatizing, and it takes a very long time to reconceive yourself in the world. Sometimes it could be a death of someone or something which you didn't think was meaningful, but maybe it wasn't your relationship to that person or that animal or whatnot, but it's the nature of change that you really have to stare directly at. And you're like, I don't know if it makes me a good parent or a bad parent, but when my father died, my kids were 5 and 3. And it was clearly impossible not to speak about the fact that he had died. It was just like this bomb went off in the middle of all of our lives. So we had to talk about it. And being a writer, when I was talking to them, I would say a life has an end. A life has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A life is a story. We have to have an end for it to have an arc. It's necessary. And we talk about narrative all the time. I used to play a game with them when they were younger, where we saw something really like out of the ordinary, like a shopping cart just kind of in the middle of the sidewalk. I would point at it and say, is that the beginning of a story? Is that the middle of a story? Or is that the end of a story? And their little minds would be like, boop, 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 and off they'd go with it. But we talked about death in that way. And of course, they were 5 and 3 then. They're 10 and 8 now. They like me enough to not like to envision my death. So succeeded that much as a parent. But what I say to them when we talk about death is I say, do you think, they would refer to my father as granddad. I said, do you think when granddad died, he felt that I was capable of taking care of myself and taking care of you and essentially kind of holding down the fort? And because I'm an adult to them, they said, yes, absolutely. And I said, I think so too. I said, well, I won't go anywhere until you're capable of holding on the fort, which I'm sure, my son's going to be like living at home in his 40s and wandering by in his underwear. He'll be like, sorry, Dad, like, I do not know how to cook. Does anyone else have a question? Anything left unresolved?
Will your future books, which I'm excited about, just given your writing style, will they have that dark slant as well, the horror-esque?
I would love to pull back from that a little bit. Froelich's Ladder was a much more, there's some darkness in that book, but it largely, I would say, has a more whimsical sensibility to it, and speaks to kind of our better natures. This book, Of Necessity, was a darker book. The book that's being shopped right now is a book about trauma. And it's a horror. It's a Victorian horror novel, basically. And my agent made me pull back on some of the horror. She was like, that's really bloody. Sorry. But then the next, so I'll say the book that I'm envisioning, I always do this thing when I'm working on one book and I'm actually kind of confounded with the responsibility of making the plot work or whatnot. I fantasize about the next book I'm going to write because I'm not responsible for that book yet. And therefore it could be perfect in my brain. You know, I'm like, oh, that book's so good. It's going to be so good. Not this piece of junk that I'm like fighting with every day. But the next book I'm envisioning, I was reading an article in the New Yorker, and it was an article about the Himalayas. And in talking about all the people who had traveled over the Himalayas over the centuries and made some mention of like, and you know, royalty in exile. And I was like, ooh, a king in exile. That's a really interesting idea. And I imagined the Spanish court in the 1400s and this person showing up and essentially telling a story that he is the exiled king from this kingdom that no one's ever heard of. He's like, you've never heard of it. How could you not have ever heard of us? We're fantastic. And he tells all these stories about this kingdom, which are just beyond plausible, just on the far side. But just when the reader and the characters are about to lose faith in him, other members of this court in exile start to appear. And that is a book that I'm projecting a lot of kind of like sunshine and happiness onto. I'm like, that could be a really happy, I could do that one well. Like West Virginia in 1899, the book I'm writing, it's not a happy book. It's bad. Like there's, you know, murder and incest. And so I'll get to a sunny, stick with me, Jonathan, and I will get us to a happy place eventually in my 50s. I'm working my way up to it.
Hey, well, that honestly, I was asking for the other direction. I enjoyed the horror, the slant, honestly. So I'm excited to hear the next two.
Well, you're like, go darker, man. Like, nah.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up like on Lord of the Rings and stuff, and I think there's always that good dynamic of, we need our heroes to look up to. But as I've become an adult in my mid 30s, you realize that even heroes are not perfect. They just on the default that they are human or elf or whatever, they exist they're not perfect. They're not always the shining. So I like that even with the space between two deaths, because even the people, they all had their faults. Every character had their faults. And like I said, what stuck to me was like, oh my gosh, this is like a Greek myth or an ancient Egyptian myth where it has that moral sometimes at the end or in the, in it. Some of them learned from it and some didn't.
Yeah.
And and not to spoil, but with Tenman, he had a quote unquote second chance within the capacity of the Me Too, and he still didn't fix it. He still, so that was, like I said, that's what it was like, man, this is, like I said, it's like I maybe hopefully 1,000 years from now, somebody, in the future will be like, oh, that's a 2020 or 2021, moral fable.
Yes, that's perfectly plausible.
Tenman is not a heroic character. From the word go, Tenman is a bad guy, unfortunately.
Well, we're getting late in the hour here. I wanted to ask you earlier, but I forgot. You brought up the writers group. How important is and how active are you in a writers group? Are you consistent?
I've got a group of writers who I meet with more or less every other week. The answer is anyone who's engaged with the writers group can make use of that community differently. I think community is incredibly important for a writer. I always encourage people to find some kind of community, and beyond writer, any kind of artist, beyond artist, any kind of human being. I find for myself, the most important thing that I get out of a writing group, I studied writing in high school. When I went to college in 1995, there were 2 colleges in the East Coast where you could even minor in creative writing. Couldn't major in it. It didn't exist as a major. So I went to one of the 2 colleges where you can minor in it. I then went immediately from college to a master's program where I got my MFA in creative writing. So like I've actually done a lot of studying of this. And like so many things in life, you learn the rules in order to both forget the rules and break the rules. But now when I'm sitting with another writer and I read 8 pages that I think are effective in these ways and ineffective in these other ways, I can't just give a thumbs up or thumbs down. I actually have to speak to that. I have to explicate that. I have to be able to say, it's less effective, it's less successful here, I think because of X, Y, and Z. And I think you're successful over here because of A, B, and C. That process, that critical process kind of gets the engine running. And I realize that I'm essentially doing the same thing and thinking the same thoughts when I'm writing my own work, except not on a top level layer. You know, I don't think like, how am I going to make this chapter effective? I may say that to myself deeper in the revision process when I'm 2 or 3 drafts in. First draft is kind of flying by the seat of my pants. But in working with other writers, I'm keeping that critical capacity alive. You know, I'm exercising it. I don't share work early on because there's a point where you just want to hoard it for yourself and you don't want to share the story. And if someone says something to you like, ooh, I like that character, make her more important. Maybe that's not the advice you need to hear until you've told the whole story. There's a great writing maxim. I think Terry Pratchett said it. I may be mistaken. But it's the first draft is the author telling himself a story. And then the second draft is the author telling the reader the story. You need to tell yourself the story first so you kind of can wrap your arms around it and say, all right, what have I got here? Great, now I know. Now I can give it to somebody else. And that first draft, I can't really share with the writing group because it's still mine. It gets to be mine for a very little while. And then ideally I share it with the world, you know, and you all read copies of this book and then it's yours. Two Deaths isn't mine anymore. It belongs to other people now, as well it should. That's the way it goes. It's actually very exciting, very satisfying to see it happen.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing it with all of us. And thank you for sharing this hour, almost an hour and a half today. So we appreciate that too. And thank you to everyone watching and participating. Do you have any last thoughts here as we sign off?
No, this was tremendous fun. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you guys will be live again this October. That's so heartening. It's fantastic. If there's any way I can make it to Collingswood, and if not, I'll be there next year. I'll give you that.
That'd be so great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the Collingswood Book Festival will be on October 2nd this year, the first Saturday in October. Stay tuned for details on www.collingswoodbookfestival.com and on Facebook and the socials.
Do you have any specific independent bookstores you want to promote for people to order from, Jamie? Or
no, you know, I will say after 2020, you do not necessarily need to do Amazon the favor of ordering this book through Amazon. It can be ordered through any independent bookstore. Any independent bookstore can get their hands on it. Not every independent bookstore will have it available on their website, so it may require a phone call and say, hi, I would like to request a book through your bookstore. I'd encourage you to do that wherever you live. Your independent bookstore will appreciate the business. So if you don't know what your independent bookstore is, do a little bit of research, get in touch with them, and ask them if they would pre-order copies of The Space Between Two Deaths, and it can be yours. Well, and my book launch on April 6th will be through Annie Bloom's, which is a local Portland bookstore. They have been kind enough to host me in a similar medium. So I certainly know that you could order through Annie Bloom's if you want to get your hands on something from Portland, Oregon.
And that's on April 6th.
April 6th.
Cool. Well, I encourage everyone to pre-order now. And if you're local to Collingswood, our local indie bookstore is Inkwood Books in Haddonfield. And I think that's all for now. We're going to sign off. This recording will be available online in the coming weeks. And thank you so much, Jamie. We appreciate all your time, and everyone else who's here today. The Collingswood Book Festival appreciates all of you too.
Thank you all so very much. My sincerest thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day.